an unidentified flying object.
Researcher on a mission with Dr. J.N. Elias.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Board at the International UFO Congress. He will also be speaking this Saturday at Cero International at the Culver City VA. You could find it all at cerointernational.com, CERO. And again, this is this Saturday, September 20th, 7 p.m. It's going to be a great lecture. And with that being said, we might as well bring on the man himself, Grant Cameron. So while we do that, we are going to call him live on air, which is something if you haven't noticed, I like to do lately, which is a great new way rather than having them wait. They are joining us directly, right, with hundreds of thousands of listeners waiting to speak to the actual person. Yes, we do take calls. Hour 2, by all means. If you do want to call, you can use the East Coast number, which is 347-688-2902. Again, 347-688-2902. Or the West Coast number, 818-923-1713. Again, 818-923-1713. And without any further ado, let's bring in Mr. Grant Cameron, like I said, the worldwide expert on presidents and UFOs, as well as the recipient of the Researcher of the Year award from the International UFO Congress. Mr. Cameron, welcome to the show.
Good evening, John. How you doing?
It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. As I was saying before, we've been working hard with Citizen Hearing and Mr. Bassett, continually keeping the witnesses and the committee members on. When we had recently Paul Hellyer on, and prior to that, who's, as you know, the highest ranking politician in the G8 countries to ever go forward on this, when we asked the Senator Gravel and, of course, Congressman Merrill Cook what it was that changed their minds from skeptic to believers, they said it was the credibility of the witnesses and the information that blew them away. And your name actually came up because they did not know the amount of information that the government actually knew as far as presidents. And that's one thing that actually blew my mind. And I'm going to blow off with this question. The Dick Cheney, the radio show, you called him on air and you asked the most important question. Not do you believe in UFOs, not something generic like that, but I'm going to let you go ahead and tell a story. What was it that you asked him that really stuck in my head more than anything?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, if you do get a high star, like a 4-star general of the Unified Command who will know what's going on, or a president, or maybe even a vice president, you don't want to ask them whether they've seen a UFO. You don't want to ask them what they think about UFOs because they'll just walk around the question. The question you want to know is the briefing question. And that means if you're a high-level official, at some point, if you are read in, somebody's going to come into your office, they're going to swear you to secrecy, and they're going to tell you what's actually going on. That's the truth. That's what the government actually knows. It's the briefing. So what I asked Cheney, because Cheney had been Secretary of Defense under Bush Sr., he had been Chief of Staff for President Gerald Ford, and when I talked to him, he was actually in the White House. He was the Vice President. This was April of 2000 and... was it 2001, and he had just been in the office, Oval Office, for let's see, it came in January, so this is April the 11th this happened, and basically the rumors were going around that Cheney was running the show, that Bush was just following instructions, and the host, who was Diana Rehm from the public radio in Washington, actually asked him, are you running the show? And he said, no, I'm not running the show. And so I asked him the briefing question. I said, in all your jobs in government, Mr. Cheney, have you ever been briefed on the subject of UFOs? If so, when was it, and what were you told? And he paused. He was caught off guard. I guess he'd never faced this question before. And he said, if I had been briefed on that subject, it would probably be classified, and I wouldn't be talking about it. And then Diana Rehm stepped in, and she said, Mr. Vice President, have you had any meetings on UFOs since you got to the White House? And by then he'd sort of caught his ground, and he said, no, I've had no UFO meetings since I got to the White House. And then the next 5 questions were all about Halliburton, about him ripping off Halliburton and all this sort of stuff. And I don't think he ever appeared on a radio talk show after that. I think it was the last one he ever went on, because he was so shocked at the questions that he came under attack, and he figured he's the big vice president. But basically, he said what I define as the number one thing. If you're looking at disclosure and you're looking at the cover-up, That's the number one reason that I say there is a cover-up, and it is basically the fact that if you're U.S. military, you classify everything, and you basically assume that we're the good guys. Al Qaeda, ISIS, Chinese, Russians, they're all evil, and we have to control the information, and therefore they just classify it, and it's almost like the element of surprise, what's called lead time in weapon technology. That if you have, for example, in World War II, if you have you drop the atomic bomb, of course, all the generals, Japanese generals, run to the emperor and say they just dropped this bomb and they killed, 125,000 people. What are we going to do? And of course, the emperor will say, "Well, build a bomb and we'll drop it on them." And how long is this going to take? And they say, "Well, about 6 or 8 years, probably." You haven't got 6 or 8 years. So that's what this whole thing is about. This is what Cheney was talking about: the fact that it's classified. And they really don't care what anybody thinks about it. We're the military. We know better. We're here to protect the people, and therefore we're going to keep it secret because it gives us the element of surprise, and we're not going to give it away to our enemies. And a number of other people have sort of been asked the question, and basically it's confirmed that there are people who know. For example, we asked General Wesley Clark, who was a 4-star general with a unified command, who was the head of NATO forces in Europe, and he had gone on the campaign trail in 2004 for the Democrats, and at one point was actually winning the Democratic nomination for president. And he went into New Hampshire, and Jay Buckley, who was a space shuttle astronaut, asked him the question, General Clark, what's your vision for space? And it was at that point that Wesley Clark went into this rant about the fact, I believe we can go past the speed of light. I've argued with physicists about this. I believe we can do it. And it was like, wow. And he had wanted to be an astronaut, and because his eyesight was no good, he'd gone into the Army and had become this 4-star general. And so, of course, the question that I tried to get across to a number of researchers in the United States as he was running, because in the early part of a presidential campaign, when they're doing the open houses or the town houses in like Iowa and New Hampshire, they will actually take questions. When it gets later in the campaign, then they have all sorts of ways to avoid questions. They don't want to say anything stupid, and they're sort of protecting their lead. But this was in New Hampshire, so it was one of the first states of the primaries, and I couldn't get anybody. It was very surprising that, a lot of people say, we want disclosure, we want something to happen. I could not get a lot of the MUFON state directors. I said, he's coming to your state. He's going to be taking questions. I want you to ask him the briefing question that I asked Dick Cheney. Ask him, you talked about the fact that we could go past the speed of light. You believed we could do it. And ask him the question, have you been briefed on the subject of UFOs? And nobody would ask the question. And it didn't happen until 2 days before the end of the campaign. Kerry had won the nomination to run against Bush. And it was 2 days before the end of the campaign. He was campaigning for Kerry. He was in Reno, Nevada. And a friend of mine, Dr. David Rudiak from outside of Berkeley, California, a very sharp researcher, had one chance before and had done the same thing as everybody else. He said, well, I really don't know if I want to really embarrass him. And I was saying to researchers, I said, well, I mean, if we're not going to stand up and ask this question, you can't expect the media to stand up and ask the question or expect somebody else to do it. This is our job. This is what we're here for. And if we're embarrassed, everybody else is going to be embarrassed as well. This is our job. So he had one chance before. He didn't ask the question, but he was in Reno, Nevada, happened to be there and saw that he was going to campaign, figured I'll ask him the question. So at the end of the lecture that he was giving, he said to him, General Clark, when you were in New Hampshire, you said you believe we could go past the speed of light. I have a question for you, General Clark. Have you ever been briefed on the subject of UFOs? And he said, General Clark looked down like he was a kid that had been caught with his hand in the cookie jar, and he was sort of very embarrassed, and he looked up and he said, I know a bit. In fact, I'm going to Roswell tonight. And we checked the schedule, and he actually was. Because what happens in the campaign, and you will see a lot of presidential campaigns and a lot of presidents will go to Roswell, New Mexico. They'll go there and make a speech because New Mexico is often a swing state. It's only got 5 electoral votes, but a lot of times they'll go Republican or Democrat. So at the end of every campaign, you'll see a lot of the campaign people show up in New Mexico to try to grab those 5 electoral votes. So it was true that he was going to Roswell the very next day. He said, I know some. In fact, I'm going to Roswell tonight. And that was when Dr. Rudiak was not fooled. He realized, go back with the question. So he said, so you were briefed. And he said, I know some stuff, but we have to work on our higher mathematics. And that is something that has come up from a number of different people, one of them being the former head of Lockheed Skunk Works, who was Ben Rich, who in March of 1993 made this famous speech to the alumni engineering people from UCLA, where he said, we've discovered the mistake in the equation. We now have the technology to take ET home. And so General Clark was basically stating the very same thing, the fact that mathematics has got something to do with this mystery. So that's what I encourage people to do. If you want disclosure, if you want this thing out, especially the campaign is about to start, you're going to have Hillary Clinton, who's extremely interested in UFOs, who's already been in Iowa once, who will be in New Hampshire. She'll be in Iowa, and she will be taking questions at these town halls. And I think it's incumbent upon somebody to stand up and ask her, and I can provide the documents that show that Hillary Clinton was involved with UFOs in an effort to get President Bill Clinton to disclose in 1993. We have 2 very direct documents that I provided to Fox News. I provided them to the Washington Post, and I provided them to Associated Press last time that Hillary ran, and they would not run the story. They had the documents, but they would not touch the story. But if we have this situation, I will provide people the documents that show quite clearly that Hillary was involved in UFOs. In fact, when Lawrence Rockefeller in 1993 went to the president, tried to get to the president, he was cut off at the pass by the science advisor, and it was at that level that they tried to deal with his demands for disclosure. And he said, I want disclosure, and if I don't get it, I will put a major ad in every major newspaper in the United States of America asking the president to disclose UFOs. And they knew that Rockefeller had the money. So they said, no, Mr. Rockefeller, hang on, we'll do what you want to do. And what do you want to do? And it was Lawrence Rockefeller who actually put out the demand that the U.S. Air Force reinvestigate Roswell. That's why they did it in 1994 and also in 1997. It wasn't because they wanted to go back and reinvestigate Roswell. They were under pressure. It was Lawrence Rockefeller who had forced the U.S. Air Force to reinvestigate, and the green light was given by Bill Clinton to go and reinvestigate. So it does help to put pressure on very high-level people. And during that whole initiative, when I filed my Freedom of Information Act request asking for all the documents while Bill Clinton was still in office, I asked for all the documents on UFOs. I got 1,000 pages of documents from the Office of the Science Advisor to the President. And this was all these documents of letters going back and forth between Rockefeller and the Science Advisor. And in there are 2 very clear documents that show Hillary's involvement. And the one was they stated that all the documents going from Lawrence Rockefeller to the Science Advisor and all the documents going from the Science Advisor back to Lawrence Rockefeller were going through Hillary Clinton's office. And the second thing that was shown was Lawrence talked about this letter, and he would get very frustrated because he wasn't really getting what he wanted. He would say, okay, I think it's time to go to the president. I think it's time to write a letter. I've had it with this. I'm going to write a demand letter to the president and demand disclosure. And they kept trying to say, no, don't write the letter, hang on to the letter. And what he would do is he would give this letter to various people and get them to edit the letter and to make changes and give advice on what should be in this letter. One of the people, and it's very clear in this document, one of the people that helped him edit a letter on UFO disclosure to President Bill Clinton was Hillary Clinton. So we have these opportunities. The election's coming up. We have very high-level people who are running. And I think it's incumbent, if we want disclosure, if we want this thing out, the people are there who are in positions of power, and we have to stand up and we have to ask the questions.
You're absolutely correct, and I'm so glad you asked the most brilliant question. And like I said earlier, not just a generic question of do you believe, like you said, have you been briefed on this subject? And when Dick Cheney responded, instead of saying no or absolutely not or what a ludicrous question, he basically implied that he knew with that answer. And when you started speaking about General Wesley Clark the first time with his rant on space, that was another implication of him knowing. But when you had Dr. was it Rudiak ask him,
Yep.
that was an expressment of him actually knowing by him saying that he knows a little bit and we need to get the mathematics correctly, which is just like you said, which is what Ben Rich said. And one other thing that Ben Rich said to that alumni of the Engineering Alumni Association was that we now, or aside from having the technology to take ET home, we have technology in the Nevada desert that would make George Lucas envious. And I think that's just another, right there, a person who would be in the proper position, who have probably handled alien artifacts, may have actually been part of reverse engineering them to know. Going back again to something we've said, and this might cut into our break, which comes in about 5 minutes, but when you were mentioning if Cheney is running the show and the host of that show that you called in, I actually had the idea that he kind of sort of was, in the sense that when George Herbert Walker Bush was president, prior to that, as you know, he was director of CIA. And it's been known or implied that going back to the formation of the CIA in 47, that they were tasked with either not necessarily dealing with the problem, but they were in the know. And I thought he absolutely was in the know. And when George W. Bush became president, all of the George H.W. Bush's people were in power. Cheney, Rumsfeld, Colin Powell. So I got the impression, too, that he knew. But the president in between, Bill Clinton, I feel that he was just completely cut out of the loop. Even when he was on Jimmy Kimmel not too long ago, he was, again, mentioning that he doesn't quite know. So what do you think about Bill Clinton? Do you think he completely was cut out of the loop in the sense that he was never briefed?
I think I used to think that. I've gone back and forth, this ultimate question. I firmly believe now that the president knows. Bill Clinton, for example, when he was on Kimmel's show, he actually doesn't get it right. He makes up something that isn't true. He said, I worked on it in my second term. He didn't work on it in his second term. The whole Rockefeller thing, the whole interest was in the first term. So he's dancing around and he wants to play this game like he looked into Roswell and he didn't get the answers and that sort of stuff. And that's a sort of a way to walk around the thing, to make people believe that he really doesn't know what's going on. What I believe, and we can maybe after the break talk about Barack Obama and what he said that shows he clearly knows. If Obama's the most left-wing president ever, if Obama knows, then the military is telling everybody. And the problem with the president not knowing is, number one, if you're dealing with aliens, you cannot have a GS-13 negotiating a contract or dealing with aliens. The only person that can deal with a foreign head of state or with a foreign country is the head of state. That is the president of the United States. Constitutionally, the president has to be involved. If the government is covering it up, he's the chief executive officer of the government. If it's the military that's coming up, he's the civilian commander of the military. If it's the intelligence that's covering it up, he's the head of all 16 intelligence agencies. That's all they do is work for him. That's their main job, is to work for him. If the president didn't know, if there was a way where he was just sort of a puppet, there would be defections. Somebody would walk out, because Americans are very patriotic. They believe in the Constitution of the United States of America. And we were after one guy, Dr. Eric Walker, and he was a very high-level guy. We can talk about it later. He said at one point, why should we change the rules to satisfy your curiosity? And from then on, I believed there are rules. These people are following the rules. They believe they're doing the right thing. And I believe the president does know, and the whole idea that the president doesn't know is just to avoid people from actually asking him the question, making him think that that he's sort of out of the loop. Bill Clinton did talk about the issue, and he said it is the ultimate tar baby. And it's the old story about the tar baby, where if you touch the tar baby, you get stuck to it. Then you use your other hand to try to get it off. Then you get your hands. And next thing you know, you're completely tangled in this tar baby. It's a subject you don't want to go near. So you find some way to keep it away from the president, to keep the questions away from the president, and allow the process to run. The president has to know on policy of what you're going to do. The president is the head of all the policy committee. He has to make these decisions. I believe firmly there would be mass defections. Somebody would walk out of there because patriotic Americans aren't going to put up with that.
And that comes to our break. Everybody stay tuned. More with Grant Cameron, President to UFOs, and so much more when we return in just a couple short minutes. Mr. Cameron gave each and every one of you listeners out there an important piece of advice of how you can aid disclosure. When a high-ranking politician or high-ranking military official is near you, ask them the question if they've ever been briefed on the topic of UFOs, and if so, when, where, and all the other details. And that's how we'll know, of course, with their implied answer, or if we'll get, of course, their express answer, like we did from General Wesley Clark. Now, right before we break, we were talking about some very important things. Mr. Cameron, I was thinking that the current presidents were cut out of the loop after Kennedy. And of course, I knew Nixon had something to do with it because Nixon was, of course, Eisenhower's vice president. But because they only served 4 to 8 year terms, I always assumed not. But like you said, they are the commanders in chief, and therefore they need to know something. But at the same time, I was worried that maybe, for instance, President Carter made his when he was governor of, I believe it was Arkansas or Georgia, he made a UFO report. But when he actually became president, he never did anything with regards to disclosure. Post-president, even recently at his book signings, he kind of sort of dodges his question. I remember when James Fox asked him if he could describe his UFO sighting a little more. He basically said, it was just a little light. I don't remember it. So do you think that when they become president, they're kind of told to toe the line and not so much disclose things, or what?
Oh, yeah, for sure. They're told to leave it alone. Let me talk about Jimmy Carter, because I think there's some, and maybe some of it came from me on my website, some of the sort of confusion. The way I look at Jimmy Carter now is, of course, you know the famous story that was told by Danny Sheehan, the story told to him by Marcia Smith about the fact that when Jimmy Carter became president-elect, he was briefed by Bush Sr., who was the CIA director for the Ford administration. And that's the way it works. When a president's elected, people got to realize, especially if you're Jimmy Carter, who comes from, as a governor of Georgia, or Reagan was a governor of California, Bush was a governor of Texas, they know absolutely nothing about anything. I mean, they don't know about foreign policy, they don't know about intelligence, they know nothing. They're a governor of a state. They're very limited in knowledge. So what they do is when the president-elect is elected in the beginning of November, and then in end of January he comes into office. During that 3-month period, he gets a pile of different briefings from various people to bring him up to speed of how this whole game is played, what the government's been up, which leaders we've knocked off, which countries we've overthrown, all the dirty details of what's gone on for the last 50 years. And what people got to remember is when they sit the president down, the president is no different than anybody else. They sit down and say, Mr. President, this is a briefing. It's got top secret and then all the code names behind it, and you're sworn to secrecy. He signs for the briefing. He's sworn to secrecy like everybody else. And if you even take a look at Obama at the last 2012 election, Obama was accused by the Republicans of leaking classified material. He leaked the fact that they were using drones to attack targets in Pakistan. And there was one other item. And they were actually trying to take him to court and to have him brought up on sort of charges that he was leaking classified material to benefit his election. So the president is no different than anybody else. So when they sit the president down, the president is told 100,000 things about all sorts of things that you would never believe that the United States would be up to, about who we killed, who's working for us, how many foreign leaders are in our working to help us and this sort of thing. He's sworn to secrecy about all of that stuff. And the president doesn't just keep quiet about UFOs. He keeps quiet about everything. You don't have the president saying, guess what? Like Jimmy Carter after he gets out. Guess what? That leader that died over in that country? That was us. We killed this guy. There's really no stuff that they talk about. So they're the same as you and I. They have to keep the secrets of what they were briefed on. So when Jimmy Carter is briefed by Bush Sr., we actually know which briefing this would have taken place, where he was told about the UFO stuff. The rumored story was that he asked Bush for the UFO files. Now, I interpreted, and everybody still interprets, that he was asking for the big files, the Roswell crash, all this sort of stuff. But I now believe that was not what he was asking for. He already had that. He, as the president, gets all that material. He gets the briefing as to what's going on. The files he was asking for were for the people of the United States of America. He was asking for UFOs to be declassified. That was the promise he had made when he was running. He made the promise twice. He said, well, if I become president, I will release all the material except for the classified weapon material. And that's what it comes down to, is like what Cheney talked about. There's certain elements that are classified. We're not going to talk about that. He said, everything else I'm going to release. So he asked for the files, not for himself, because he's got those files already, but for the people of the United States of America. And the proof of that is that Bush says to him, I can't give you the files. If you want those files, you have to go to the House of Representatives Science and Technology Committee to get those files. The House Science and Technology Committee is not going to have the file on Roswell. It's not going to have the file on back engineering saucers. They're a very low-level committee. They're going to have maybe the files that the people might want. The real files are held by National Security Agency, by the Air Force, by the Navy is one of the big agencies. Those were the big heavy files are contained in there, not with the House. They're not going to have it in a House committee, have all the top secret files. So what I'm saying now is that was what he was asking for. And the other impression that people got, and I probably put this out years ago, was the fact that Jimmy Carter really hadn't done anything, that he got in and he shut the door and he didn't do anything. He did. This one example was he asked for the files, which I believe were the files for the people. He sent his press secretary to NASA and to get another Blue Book started. And Frank Press was the science advisor, went to NASA, and we've got all the documents. We found all the documents where NASA basically, Carter had cut their budget by $5 billion. And it was like, are you kidding? I mean, you cut our budget. Now you want us to run this PR nightmare. And that's what Blue Book was. That's why they don't want to handle the UFO issue. It's because it's a PR nightmare. If you do have an open situation where the government is investigating UFOs, then every time there's a big, huge sighting in California, they've got to put somebody out to explain what that was. And if they know it's a flying saucer and that it had involved aliens and they don't want to talk about it, they have to make some sort of stupid explanation. And the way they can do it now, if they work in the black world, they say, we've given you all the files, we're not interested in it. And all they have to do to get the files, for example, the abduction files, all they got to do is push the button and pull all the stuff off Yvonne Smith's computer. They can push the button and pull all Bud Hopkins files, all John Mack's files, all the files of all the researchers. I'll just push a button and do it in the background from some guy sitting in the basement of the Pentagon. They don't have to do any public releases. They don't have to do anything. They can basically, you and I are doing their job for them. We're doing the researching, and they can tap into our computers and find out what's going on, where the sightings are, what's taking place. So Jimmy Carter went to NASA, and he wanted this new Blue Book set up. And NASA came back and said, the way they got out of it, they got a letter from the Air Force, and the Air Force said, from the CIA said, at no point do you agree to this. And so they said, we will analyze any hardware that people have that they believe it came from a crashed saucer or whatever, but we don't have the resources to do another study. And so they walked around it. There was Alfred Weber talks about a study that was set up on extraterrestrial intelligence at Stanford Research Institute, and that later on, a couple months into it, there was a guy from the Pentagon came and shut the program down. Jimmy Carter's press secretary, Jody Powell, was sent to the FBI, and he was pressuring the FBI to identify the UFO files they had, how they investigated UFO files, and the last one. If you listen to all the background stuff, Kit Green, who worked in the CIA, who was sort of ran the weird desk, the UFO files, tells these stories about when Jimmy Carter came in, the fact that there was tremendous pressure inside the CIA on this Freedom of Information Act request, that there was lawyers inside the CIA. They were pressuring them to open the files. And what had happened is Kit Green he was interested in UFOs. He had some of his private UFO material in his office, and that material had been grabbed by the lawyers. And he was called up on the carpet and said, get this stuff out of the office. Why did you bring this stuff into the office? They were under tremendous pressure. And Kit Green talks about the woman for the CIA, who was in charge of this FOIA that Jimmy Carter was putting pressure on, that she broke down crying. She couldn't take the pressure. That Jimmy Carter did an awful lot, but he didn't do it directly, and that's how it works. You don't do it directly out front. You do it through the back door, and Jimmy Carter had at least 5 or 6 initiatives where he was trying to get the material out. And then, as Shirley MacLaine describes, because Shirley MacLaine was close friends with Jimmy Carter, and she campaigned for his son. His son ran for state senator in Nevada. She campaigned. She was very good friends. She said, she asked Jimmy Carter, what happened? Why wasn't this done? And according to her, Jimmy Carter told her, I tried to open up the intelligence to see how the people would react, but that I couldn't and I won't. So basically, he's saying he knew what was going on. He tried to open it up, the intelligence, open this thing up to see how people would react to the fact that there was extraterrestrial intelligence, but that he couldn't and wouldn't, because he was under these security classification things, and he had gotten into a lot of trouble. If you remember, he got in trouble for leaking the stealth, for leaking the fact that they had the stealth fighter. He came under a lot of attack for leaking this, and he also came under attack for leaking the fact that they had a remote viewing program. He'd come out with this file, and it had the Stargate on the thing, and they had to change the name of the program because Jimmy Carter had leaked that as well. So he was under a lot of pressure to keep quiet. But he did do a lot of material. And if you listen to the story with Danny Sheehan tells the story about being brought in from the House Intelligence Committee, or not Intelligence, but Science and Technology Committee, where Bush had told Carter to go. They had requested a study that was done by the Congressional Research Office, and Marcia Smith was running the study. And Danny Sheehan tells the story because he was the advisor, the head of legal counsel for the Jesuits in Washington, D.C. at the time. And the story he tells is that this study that was being done for Jimmy Carter on UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence wanted him, as the head of the Jesuit council in Washington, to go to the Vatican Library. His friend was a Jesuit at the Vatican Library, to ask for the Vatican files on UFOs. So Danny Sheehan has told the story numerous times. He wrote the letter to the Vatican Library to his friend, and the letter came back and said, no, you can't have the UFO files. The second letter was written and said, on behalf of the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, we are requesting the UFO files from the Vatican Library. And he said he was shocked. The letter came back and said, no, you cannot have the files. But he talks about the fact that there was a classified report that went back to the president, and the one was on UFOs, the one was on extraterrestrial intelligence, and the extraterrestrial intelligence report that went to the President of the United States, written by Marcia Smith at the Congressional Research Office, said that it is believed, based upon evidence from all the UFO sightings, that there are at least between 2 and 6 highly advanced extraterrestrial races visiting the Earth. So Jimmy Carter was getting this input. The thing is, it's one thing for the president to get all this input, to get all this material. It's another thing for him to leak classified material to the public. And that's where sort of the roadblock is. And that's where the pressure has to be on the intelligence system, and asking these people when they really don't see it coming about the briefing. Because every time they stumble on the briefing question, someone is going to pick up and say, man, he hesitated. There must be something to this. And sooner or later, somebody's going to make the move and realize that there is something to this, that somebody's going to say something they shouldn't say, which is what happened to Cheney. Cheney shouldn't have said what he said. He did release the fact that it was classified. He confirmed this is for real. He didn't laugh at my question. He confirmed this is a real subject, and that's what people have to do.
And again, that's why I thought it was the most brilliant question. And everything you just said about Carter, this is why you are the worldwide expert on presidents and UFOs. You've done more digging and know more information than anyone else, and that is why it is truly an honor to speak to you. Going back to two things, the Vatican, first of all, during the Carter administration, I too am shocked that they turned that down. And of course, Daniel Sheehan has been in a very good position, everything from defending John Mack to being part of the committee at the citizen hearing. He had something to do with a case where he was shown some Roswell photos. So I definitely think that he would be a right person to do something like that. But the Vatican currently now has kind of changed their stance, it seems to me, as they've been setting up for disclosure. And obviously when that happens, it has to be on a worldwide scale. And earlier we mentioned Obama. And I've heard from several people that they thought that he would be the disclosure president. But what I fear is that he's now in his lame duck period. What do you think? Do you think that we're going to actually get it out of him? Is POTUS ever going to stand on that famous podium that he's always giving his today when he talked about Syria? Is he ever going to come forward and say, for 67 years, we've had Roswell wreckage, even earlier than that, going to Cape Girardeau, 1941 incident, and we've been reverse engineering and visiting Earth, or being visited. What do you think is going to happen with him? And then, of course, when we get to the next hour, we're going to talk about how you think disclosure is going to come about.
I don't believe that he will do it except under tremendous pressure, where he stumbles, and he has stumbled a number of times. I mean, Barack Obama has made a number of very dramatic statements, and the fact is the media never picks up on it, and even the UFO community doesn't pick up on it. And the most famous one he did was in Roswell. He went to Roswell, as most presidents do. This happened in 2012. He's campaigning again. He's opening some oil well field or something to do with the oil fields or whatever. And it's at that point where he talks about the question that's asked to him most by 9 and 10-year-old kids is, Mr. President, what about Roswell? Is it true what they say? Now, he didn't have to bring that up. I mean, he could have left that out. He could have made some sort of other joke. He purposely put that in a speech. And if you study enough presidential speeches, you realize that every presidential speech is checked, double-checked, fact-checked. It is unbelievable. Some of these speeches go through 30 drafts, like a State of the Union address will go through 30 drafts. There'll be 30 different agencies that have to sign off. If it mentions the Defense Department, the Defense Department has to sign off on what's in that speech. It's tremendously detailed how a speech is done. So when Barack Obama stands up and starts with this fact that the question that's asked to him most by 9 and 10-year-old kids is, Mr. President, what about Roswell? Is it true what they say? This is on purpose. He's doing this on purpose. And then he makes the joke about the fact that he tells the little kids, if I told you that, I'd have to kill you. And how their eyes get all big and everybody laughs. And then he hesitates. He's going into the speech. This is not, I've seen enough presidential speeches. This was not in the speech. He's ad-libbing this. He hesitates, and just before he starts the speech, he says, we'll keep our secrets here. So he's saying, the Roswell thing is for real, and we will keep our secrets. There's been very dramatic, and I wrote this book called UFOs, Area 51 and Government Informants, and I did the detail in there how they disclose this thing, how they drop this kind of stuff. And this is what Obama was doing. They do it all the time. The Chase Brandon story is the absolute best. We'll talk about that in the next break. Chase Brandon was a clear disclosure effort by the government.
Everybody stay tuned. More when we come back from Grant Cameron on So Much More President.
He knew this story would get out. He knew this was going to be picked up by people. And this is one of these questions where if suddenly some media guy picks up that, and he's got access to the president, he's suddenly going to say, what are you talking about, Mr. President? Because what happened was Jaden had told his father, Will Smith, because they had done the Men in Black, the latest movie, he was getting a tour of the White House by Barack Obama. And he said to his dad, he said, Dad, when I get to the White House, I want to ask President Obama about the aliens. And Will Smith said, no, you're not going to ask him. You're not going to embarrass me. You're not asking him about the aliens. He said, yeah, Dad, I want to ask the president about the aliens. He said, no, you're not going to ask about the aliens. Do not embarrass me. So they're going through the White House, and Will Smith tells the story. They go through and they get to the Situation Room, and this is where they watched the assassination of bin Laden. This is where the center of power in the White House is the Situation Room. They're in the Situation Room. He's giving a tour, and Jaden looks over at his father and he says, Dad, what's my punishment? And his father looks at him and says, no, don't do it. And no question is asked. And Barack says, I know what you want to ask about. You want to know about the aliens, don't you? And Jaden says, yeah, I want to know about the aliens. And he said, I can neither confirm nor deny that extraterrestrials have visited the Earth. But if they have, and if there had been a top secret meeting on the subject, it would have occurred in this very room. And Jaden went, yeah, I knew it. Now, there's something that Barack knew was going to get out. And no reporter, you could have a Washington Post, New York Times reporter, some major guy saying, what did you mean when you talked to Jaden about the fact that there was a meeting? Was there a meeting? And start the snowball rolling. But the media stands back and does nothing. Let me give you another example. Chase Brandon. And this is the most direct evidence of disclosure. Chase Brandon comes out on the 65th anniversary of Roswell, the same as Corso came out on the 50th anniversary of Roswell, and he tells a story. He tells this story about being at Langley headquarters, and Chase Brandon is a very, very powerful guy. He, at one point, was the second most powerful person inside the CIA to speak publicly on behalf of the CIA, because he was the liaison to Hollywood. He could go into Hollywood, make deals with Hollywood directors in exchange for giving them information on how to run spies and how it should work. He would get cooperation from the guys to take certain things out of movies and stuff like that. So he had this influence over media about the CIA. So I made him a very powerful guy. He could speak and say whatever he wanted. He didn't have to get it approved by the CIA before he talked. He comes out, and I talked to, he appeared on John Wells' show on Coast to Coast. I talked to John Wells after this, and John told me that Chase Brandon told him that the book that he had come out with at this time was called Christo's Conundrum, had been reviewed 8 times by the CIA. If a book is coming out about, and it was about Roswell, it was about how the CIA handled the Roswell crash. If it was reviewed 8 times by the CIA was writing the book. They were telling, pull out this, put this in, and basically they wanted this story out. So Chase Brandon, this very powerful guy, he was 25 years clandestine agent for the CIA, 10 years as the military liaison to the CIA liaison to Hollywood, and then he's under contract. He says, we never quit. We always like to try to help out. He's still under contract. The CIA has been for almost 10 years. So he's almost 45 years as a CIA guy. Very, very powerful guy. Comes out and he's on the coast to coast. He goes on in front of millions of people. He doesn't pick some little tiny show. Goes on there and he says, John, I'll just tell you, I was there. I was in this room. And what he does is he makes a fictionalized story. This is how disclosure takes place. What they want to do is they don't want to spill the milk, but they will tell the story indirectly through a fictional story surrounded by disinformation. So that if the story starts to fall apart, they'll say, oh, it was just, disinformation. We really weren't serious about this. And what he says is he's in Langley. He's waiting for a TV crew inside the collections facility where they have all the archives boxes. There are no people allowed, TV cameras in this. It's a very high secure area. So he wouldn't. And he said, I was in there by myself, which doesn't happen because you're not allowed in this room by yourself. You always have to have a CIA person with you that controls the collections. And so a couple of things are wrong already in his story. And he's fictionalizing a story. And he said, I'm standing there, I'm waiting for the TV crew, and I look up and there's this box, one of the archives boxes, and it says Roswell on the side. And I open up the box, I look inside, and I cannot confirm what I saw in the box. And the reason he can't, it comes down to this classified thing. If he describes a specific document, if he describes a specific photograph, if he describes something secret, it's the same as the President of the United States. It's classified material. You cannot release classified material. So he makes up this story. He says, I cannot tell you what was in the box, but I can absolutely confirm to you that Roswell was for real, and that it was extraterrestrial, and that there were cadavers. How much more do you have to say? He says it in front of millions of people. He's a high-level CIA guy. He says Roswell was real, it was extraterrestrial, and there were bodies involved. And nobody picks up the story. I and 3 other researchers go after the CIA because a couple of researchers from England, Robbie Graham, who is the CIA expert dealing with UFOs, writes a letter. I had got the honor of co-signing this letter to the CIA, and we say, what was Chase Brandon? Confirm or deny what Chase Brandon said. The CIA says, hang on, we'll answer the question. And then about a week later, Robbie Graham puts another letter back and says, we're waiting for this answer. And they say, we cannot confirm what Chase Brandon said about the documents. We cannot find the documents. So we go back with a question to Chase Brandon through some of the people who are interviewing him. And Chase Brandon said he was not talked to by the CIA after he made this announcement on Coast to Coast. Huffington Post picks it up, gets 7 million, 8 million hits, whatever it was on the website. They go back. I talk to the Huffington reporter. I say, here's the questions you need to ask this guy. And he's having a second interview. And then Chase Brandon says, I've decided I'm not going on the record for the second one. I'll have a couple of beers. So he sits and has a couple of beers with the reporter, and everybody walks away from the story, and it dies. Nobody does anything. They clearly stated, a high-level CIA guy comes out and says, Roswell was real. It was extraterrestrial. involved cadavers, and nobody picks up on the story except for Billy Cox from the Tampa Tribune. And I've worked with him for a number of years. He writes a blog. He's the only reporter that writes a UFO blog. He's done it for 25 years. He's in an opportunity where Robert Gates is making a speech in Florida. He gets in front of him, and it's one of these things where you challenge the guy with the question. And he starts to ask the UFO question. He said he could feel the reporters moving away from him as they realized what it was about to happen. And he said, Chase Brandon, one of your top CIA guys, made this statement that Roswell was real. It involved extraterrestrial bodies. And this guy's former CIA director. What have you got to say about this? And he said, Chase Brandon is an honorable man. He used to teach self-defense courses at the CIA. That's all I'm going to say. And again, everybody just walks away. They go to the next question, and the story dies. So they've done it over and over again. They did it in the 1970s with Bob Amenegger and Alan Sandler. They released the fact that they had a film called the Holloman Air Force Base film that is shown to every president during the presidential briefing, where the aliens land at Holloman Air Force Base. The aliens come out. They're greeted by officials. This is a story that they clearly had. They put 8 seconds of the film in the actual documentary, confirmed to me by Bob Amenegger, the producer of the film. It was given to them. They had no problem. They were able to talk to anybody they wanted inside the military, inside the Pentagon. They were able to do whatever they wanted. They said they didn't have the right questions at the time. But this is over and over again. The government has leaked stuff, leaked it, and the fact that nobody's picking it up is why there's no disclosure. They are handing us this thing on a silver platter.
You're absolutely correct. That's what worries me about the mainstream, and that's why I think we are ripe for disclosure. 30 years ago, there was a few main corporations that literally were controlling every bit of media we got, from newspapers to television to all media. But now people can be out somewhere, such as and see a UFO, film it, upload it to YouTube, and be on a radio show such as this, alternative media. This is the new wave of the future that the government hasn't censored, and this is why I think we're ripe. Now, I'm glad you mentioned all these stories. One more, like you said, that was not quite picked up by mainstream media, which I thought was extremely important, was when President Medvedev in Russia was asked by. I'll let you go ahead and tell that story.
That was the Medvedev story where he is, and I contacted the reporter. She was with the biggest private television network in the Soviet Union. Her name escapes me right now, but she asked him the question about are the president and the prime minister told about UFOs when they come in? And he says to her, very important thing he opens up with, for the last time. Then he starts talking about the fact that they're given the suitcase when they come in, and you can see that she's sort of smiling, she's sort of laughing. And he said, if you, we don't want to scare the people. If you really want to know, take a look at Men in Black. And everybody, when it first came out, assumed that he was saying, look at the movie, the Will Smith movie from Hollywood, Men in Black. But what I did when I did the research later on, I found out that network, the biggest private network in the Soviet Union, had done a documentary about UFOs, and it was called Men in Black. So he's referring to the documentary that was done by the network, and he basically comes out and he says, yes, this is for real. And again, it's like, oh, well, he's joking, and everybody just sort of walks away with it. And I think what the problem is that people have to realize that if you're a White House reporter and you get up to be in the White House, Deborah Orrin talked about this. When Bill Clinton was in office in 1997, Webster Hubbell came out with a book called Friends in High Places, where he talks about his days at the Clinton White House. And he said one of the jobs that was given him when he was the associate at Justice, the associate director, he said, Bill said, if I put you over there in Justice, I want you to find out the answer to two questions for me. Number one, who killed JFK? Because Clinton had an obsession with JFK. Who killed JFK? And the second obsession he had was UFOs. He said, and are there UFOs? And Hubble went to NASA, he went to Air Force, and he wasn't really able to get anything, according to his story. And he comes back, but in his book, he writes about this. Now, when the story broke, when the book first came out, Deborah Orrin from the New York Post was at the White House the next morning after the book was released, and she's in the press conference with the White House press, the White House press secretary. And she asked the question because she hates the Clintons, and it's a right-wing newspaper. The New York Times is the sort of the left wing, and the Post is the right wing. So she hated them. She did all the Monica Lewinsky stories. She said Mr. Hubble has come out in his book, and he said that Bill Clinton asked him to look for UFOs. Is this true? And then they said, no, we gave that job to the alien. And the alien was this one from the Weekly World News. If you remember, this alien was always predicting who was going to win and stuff. This is the alien they're talking about. No, we gave that job to the alien. And then she comes back with a follow-up question. She says, is it true what Mr. Hubble writes in his book? And the press secretary says, I'm not going to comment what private people put in their private book, saying he's not in part of the government anymore. I don't have to answer the question. He's a private citizen. I'm not going to answer the question. And Deborah Orrin said in an interview after this happened, about 10 years later, she said in an interview, I sat there and I waited for someone to follow up on the question, and the rest of the White House press corps rolled over and played dead. And that's because if you work your way to the White House and you get there, you don't want to be the guy to ask a stupid UFO question because you're never going to ask another question. They're never going to call on you, and you will be fired immediately because if you're from the New York Times, New York Post, you asked a stupid question, they're going to pull you off because you embarrassed them, and now the New York Times is not going to get any questions asked. So everybody's very, very sensitive about what kind of questions that they're asking. Nobody wants to ask the dumb question because it's the last question they'll ever ask of the White House.
And you're absolutely right. But the sad part is it's not a dumb question. It is the most important question and the most important topic of all time.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's what I'm going to call, like I'm lecturing in Ciro on Saturday night. I say this is the most important story of all times. If you realize the implications of the UFO story and its implications to consciousness and reality and how things work in the world, then you realize that this, I call it, if UFOs were stories, the UFO story would be the Super Bowl of all stories. And that's when I talk to contactees, which I spend most of my time now doing, is dealing with contactee people. And I say to them, you have been chosen. You have been picked. Your parents were probably picked. Your children will be picked. You have been picked. You may not know why you're being picked, but you could have been a pauper or a poor person in Calcutta. You could be getting this disease in Africa. You could have been picked for a lot of stuff. You got picked to play in the Super Bowl. If you understand the story that you're in, you've been picked. And you got some sort of message, you've got some sort of involvement, and you should realize that you're playing in the Super Bowl, and there could have been a lot worse things that happened to you. So to me, the contactees, the abductee people who have been inside the ship, who have had contact with the people who are flying this thing, are the most important people.
And that brings us again to our final break. Everybody stay tuned. We're going to be finishing up on talking about the most important thing that I think is, again, the contactees and abductees. Stay tuned. More with Grant Cameron. And Saturday, you're going to be giving a lecture on these chosen ones. What can the listeners that are listening right now expect to hear if they join us this Saturday?
Okay, well, what I'm going to do, the lecture is called The Chosen and What I've Learned from Them. Because basically what happened to me is I was the nuts and bolts guy. I chased the Canadian government. I chased this former president of Penn State University. I chased the president of the United States for 20 years. And I came to realize that all these people may know what's going on, but they are never going to tell you. And or they may tell you down the road. But right at this present point, nobody's talking. So it's kind of like banging your head against the wall. And as you were pointed out, the people who are the contactees are the closest people to what's actually going on. When we do a lot in ufology, we sort of spend a lot of time like standing up on the top of a skyscraper watching these little things move around on the streets. And we can't figure out what they are. We know there's some green ones and some red ones and some fast ones, some slow ones and big ones and small ones. And you can't tell anything. You can't tell what's going on. It's not until you take the elevator down, run out into the street like Travis Walton did and flag one of these things down and get taken on board that you start to learn what's actually going on. So what I'm going to do there is I'm going to point out the fact that these are the most important people in the world, and I'm going to put it into some perspective, because a lot of people get the idea that if you're a hillbilly or if you're a loser in society, those are the people that get abducted. One of the things I've done in research in the last year is I have done the research dealing with disclosure of the aliens. And I have a video that I'll be selling there. It's a 2-hour and 20-minute video where I talk about the disclosure, how the aliens are disclosing. One of the things that they are doing is they are using modern-day musicians to get across messages. And I was first told this by Chris Bledsoe, who's a very famous abductee out of North Carolina, that Warner Brothers is now making an $80 million movie on his case. I know him very well. I was actually involved in part of his story. And he phoned me up and he said, I just want to let you know that the aliens have told me that they are using musicians to get across the message. The two songs he gave me were Led Zeppelin's Kashmir, and the second one was a song called After the Gold Rush by Neil Young. So I start my lecture by this, and I sort of point out the fact that if you think that you are some hillbilly, that you're just a loser because you're in this sort of thing, let me put you in perspective. And what I'm going to do Saturday night is I'm going to go through all the musicians that have seen UFOs. Mostly leave that out. There's a lot of them have seen UFOs. I'll refer to some of them: Presley, Stones, Mick Jagger, UFO people or musicians who have seen a couple hundred at a time. One musician from Led Zeppelin, from Yes Band, who saw thousands at one time. I'll go through all that, but what I'm going to spend a lot of time, and I'm going to go through the lyrics, I'm going to go through all the modern day musicians who have been abducted, and it is unbelievable. It is basically, at one point I thought they had them all. It was like they are basically big time downloading messages. And when Chris Bledsoe first told me about these two, I really didn't pay much attention to it, even though the message on Neil Young's song called After the Gold Rush is basically the message that every contactee gets aboard the ship. And the message that he had after the gold rush is the whole idea that we are treating the world like a gold rush. And when the gold is gone, it's going to be like a ghost town, and the silver seeds, he calls them the silver seeds, are going to come down, and they're going to take the chosen ones and take them to another planet. And so this is basically the message. This was written in 1968, and Neil Young said he doesn't know what it meant. He was totally stoned when he wrote it, but this is basically the message. And when I got that, I really didn't pay any attention because I'm not a musical guy. I have no interest in music whatsoever. It wasn't until Colin Andrews, who had the same sort of road as me. He was sort of a nuts and bolts type guy, and then suddenly got into consciousness. He suddenly had this sort of awakening. He got into consciousness, and he tells the story of 5 different bands that come to him after he has lectured on crop circles. And these bands want to tell him a story. And the one I'll tell you, which is a critically important one, is the band called the Moody Blues. The Moody Blues, it's quite well known that they were abducted in 1967. The story's been written about. They've talked about it. They've drawn the alien. One of them drew the alien that he thought was involved. They were coming into London from Manchester, and it was in the middle of the morning. They saw this object. They stopped, and they arrived in London 3 hours late. So they knew they'd been abducted. They knew something had happened. They come to Colin Andrews. He's lecturing on crop circles, and the Moody Blues, John Pinder, who's the head of the Moody Blues, and the lead guitarist come to Colin Andrews, and they say, we've got to tell you a story. We want to meet with you after the lecture. Colin Andrews says, okay. They go for dinner, and Colin Andrews says the speech is going back and forth. So it's not something made up the story. It's the one guy says, and then the other guy says, tell him this, and then this, and this, and the story's going back and forth, and they're both telling this story. And what they do is they tell the story that before they were born, they remember being in a room, a round table, and there was some wise leader type people who were telling them, this is going to be your mission. You are going to put messages into music. And they knew before they were born, and they describe coming into this world. They came together, and this was all agreed upon. And this is a very important thing, especially when you get to abductees and contactees, because Chris Bledsoe talks about the same thing. During his regression, he talked about the fact that he'd made a promise. And John Mack's associate, Dr. Michael O'Connor, asked him, what's the promise? What are you talking about? He said, they have been with me since before I was born. And the message, was to give this message. That was the promise he was making. I'll keep the message. I'll give the message. I'm going to tell the people the message. So if something happens before you're born, then the whole UFO thing no longer is a physical problem. It's a spiritual problem. It goes over multiple lifetimes. And the agreements are made before we come into this earth. And the whole thing is a lot of it's prearranged. So when I talk about aliens disclosing, it's all this prearranged stuff that you start to look at the UFO field and how it all unfolded, and you start to see that things are not happening randomly, that you can basically see the types of UFOs keep changing. There's ground traces, then there's no ground traces. There's little aliens running around with little rods. Now there's no aliens running around with rods. And you see this type of thing. And Colin Andrews tells me 5 different bands that come to him and tell him exactly the same story, that they are being used to put messages into music. So I go through Saturday night, I'll go through all the musicians that have been abducted, that have seen UFOs, and particularly the ones who have received messages. And one of the big ones that I'll make public there is the story of John Anderson, who is the lead for the band Yes, which sold 50 million or more albums, big British rock band. And he's talked numerous times about the fact that he believes that all art, all the music comes from the Pleiades. He's had numerous UFO experiences, but the one he's told to 5 people privately that I know, he's never told it on the air, but he tells the story that he's doing a concert with the band Yes in Las Vegas, Nevada, and he's at the Caesars Palace in Las Vegas, and he's in his room at night, and an alien comes through the wall and gives him information. That is pretty direct information that band people are being influenced. And the reason that they're doing it, it's this whole idea that it's all orchestrated, that the aliens have a plan of disclosure. And the reason that they're dealing, my impression, the reason that they are dealing with modern musicians is because all major social and political movements are headed up by young people. The end of the war in Vietnam, civil rights, gay marriage, the AIDS thing. It was all young people. There was no old people with lots of money on the Washington Mall. It was all young people. When a kid is born, the aliens will abduct him. As soon as a kid becomes 9 years old, until then, his parents are his heroes. As soon as a kid becomes 9 or 10 years old, suddenly the parent is a total idiot. Get away from me. I don't want you around me. My friends are my influence. They're looking for something new. They don't want to be like their parents. They want something new. They're looking for new ideas. And so between the time they're 10 years old and they're 25 years old, they're building their worldview. And that is who the musicians are singing to. That's their heroes, and that's who the aliens are influencing, because once a kid gets to be 25 years old, the religion is set, their political set, everything is set. It's useless to talk to anybody after they're 25 years old. You cannot really change many minds. You have to get them at that critical stage when they're looking for new ideas, when they're teenagers, and it is unbelievable. How many musicians? I had another one today. Major musician in Canada, been confirmed, said numerous experience, missing time. This happens over and over again. This is one of the methods that the aliens are using to disclose the UFO story, to get out the different messages about move from fear to love, the fact that we're destroying the planet. These are all messages are coming through this music, and this is part of the disclosure of the aliens.
I'm really glad you brought up the music. I have a few points I want to bring back to everything. First, you mentioned that not just the poor hillbillies are being abducted. Like you mentioned, everybody, just as John Mack said, rich, poor, gay, straight, politicians, astronauts, you name it. Every spectrum of human being has, and from every continent has been taken. And like you said, they are the chosen ones. Now, with regards to musicians, you're absolutely right. First of all, music is a huge influence. And like you said, the teenagers, while they're developing and rebelling, that's what they're paying attention to, and the music ingrains in their minds. And speaking of musicians, two recent things. First of all, I don't know if you know this, but the Megadeth star, I don't know what his name is, recently filmed UFOs on his porch. And this video is going viral lately. And several months ago, at the late Dr. Roger Lear, I used to work very closely with him, did a couple documentaries, and I was at the last surgery he performed removing an implant. Well, in the audience, of the people who were watching the monitor, but someone who didn't want to appear on camera was Jack Osbourne. And I got him to agree to do an interview, and of course we did it right here on Revolution Radio. And Jack Osbourne, when I asked him what his interest came in UFOs, his number one interest, he said, was abductions, alien abduction. And I said, when did this start? And he said he doesn't remember. He's been interested in this in his entire life. And that got me the impression that if you have that interest since you've been pretty much almost born, or if you can't remember when it started, maybe you are one of the people taken, or maybe his family. As you know, speaking with Yvonne Smith and all these other abduction specialists, they say the number one prerequisite for being taken is that your parents were taken. So if Ozzy Osbourne was taken and told to implement in his music UFOs or references to that, of course I would think that Jack Osbourne maybe have taken up on that, or he wasn't very open maybe when he was saying or inferring that someone in his family may have been taken. So I just wanted to touch on those points. One final thing. And like you said, Colin Andrews, I'm glad he started writing up on consciousness. His last book on the edge of reality, amazing because it linked up everything. Scientists are wrong when they try to separate UFOs from consciousness. You can't. They're interrelated, and that's a very important point that a lot of people fail to mention. So I just wanted to touch on those points, and I think you are definitely on the right side of where we're leading to. And these musicians are absolutely changing the world for us, and maybe they will be leading to disclosure. Do you have an idea of what the next step would be to get us to that Super Bowl when they're finally going to be plucked and told their game plan, or remember their game plan?
Yeah, I think it's just more of the same. I mean, if you take a look at the way it is now, I mean, I think science is the major roadblock that we have. I don't think it's the media. I think it's science, because if you take a look at the National Academy of Sciences, only 4% of people, the 2,000 scientists in the National Academy of Sciences, the highest level, believe in any sort of paranormal phenomena. Only 7% of them claim to have any sort of belief in God. And that is because they bought into this physical worldview. And it's almost like the Vatican was many years ago, is that the higher you get up into this power echelon, if you say something that goes against the grain of the predominant view, you're finished. Your career is over. So you do not talk about it. So even though if you believe in sort of paranormal phenomena or consciousness, I mean, that is the main thing in the predominant view. Most people don't realize in the physical, materialistic, scientific world is that consciousness is an illusion, and that free will is an illusion. There is no such thing as consciousness. It is just an illusion, and so is free will. And I mean, it's like unbelievable to believe that people would believe this. But if you have the physical world, you can't have consciousness. That's the big problem. So I think that's the main roadblock. But I think as we move along, we're getting closer and closer all the time. You get more and more people, and the young people are basically on board with this thing. And I think it's going to be coming down to something where there's going to be some sort of way they can get out of it with discovery of some sort of planet or some sort of a virus where it really starts to open up. But the problem is always going to be this classified thing. Is are they going to be willing to release the fact that this is all for real, and then somehow try to keep the fact that they've got this technology, that they've got this, especially the consciousness technology of trying to figure out how consciousness works and how to control the people's minds and stuff like that. That's where they're trying to fight back. But in terms of disclosure, the government has basically disclosed everything that we know. If you take a look at the worldview we have, they've given it to us all. Area 51 was disclosed to us. MJ12 was disclosed to us. They've given us piles of stuff about Roswell, Chase Brandon coming forward. And it's a gradual thing. And you get guys like Bassett who are continuing that pressure and continuing to raise consciousness. That's what it's all about. It's getting the people on the outside to realize that this thing is for real. And you may not see it. It's like a drip, drip, drip thing. But I can absolutely assure you that it is moving along, that people are much more open to it. When I first started in 1975, people would sort of laugh at you. No, nobody laughs anymore. I really haven't really seen that. People are just saying, you haven't shown me the proof. But everybody realizes that this is probably going to be for real. We've got movies. They're leaking stuff into movies. I think it's I don't know what the timetable is, but we're moving along pretty quickly towards some sort of disclosure, or at least acknowledgement that this whole subject is for real.
You're absolutely correct. They are acclimating us. And I remember watching documentaries from the 80s, in the 90s. For every minute a ufologist was speaking, even I remember on Larry King when Edgar Mitchell was speaking and he had the science guy who kept interrupting, there would be 1 minute of a debunker that would speak against them. Michael Shermer, or the other people I mentioned, Robert Schaefer, or the other guy who I can't remember, James McCann, or nonetheless, you don't hear that anymore. When there's a documentary on Hangar One, or the one that you did that I saw, that the amazing one on History Channel, White House and UFOs, you don't see a debunker in there, whereas 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, you did. So you're absolutely correct that we are moving along. Now, with the leaks, like you said, we've gotten everything from MJ12, from the Eisenhower briefing document to the Special Operations Manual. You are absolutely correct. We are getting drips and drips and drips. And that's why with what you mentioned, Stephen Bassett, I've been actively working with him with the citizen hearing because I want to keep that alive. I think one of the biggest government, the things with involving the government, even though it was a mock hearing, if we were able to convince, or I should say you, because you were one of the witnesses, you were able to convince 5 retired congressmen and 1 senator, all who came in as skeptics, to not only say, oh, there's something there, because I watched that transformation over those 5 days. Yep. At the end of the 5 days, they conclusively said, not only are we being visited by one or more races, but the government's been hiding this since 1947. Without a doubt, every single one has said that. Now, if we could only get the rest of the world, whether it be the UN or now coming in November, Mr. Bassett's delivering the DVDs to the actual Congress. I
understand this. It is up to us to move it along, and it really doesn't matter whether it happens tomorrow or next year. It matters. Am I doing what I'm supposed to do because I've got knowledge that I should share? If I sit and do nothing, then it really doesn't matter whether disclosure happens or not. I'm at fault. And if it takes another 100 years, I did what I could. I do as much as I can every day to move the ball down the field. And that's all I can really do. I can't really change what the government's going to do. I really can't change what you do or what anybody else does. All I can do is control my own life. And that's what I do.
And I'm really glad you mentioned that. I think that is a truly amazing quote. Wisdom and knowledge not used is truly a sin. We are given knowledge for a purpose. And I'm again, another thing I'm glad you said is that it's up to each and every person out there to do something about it. Like you said earlier, last hour, for each person out there listening, if you come across a high-ranking official or you come across a politician or somebody who you think might be in the know, such as a 4 or 5-star general, ask them the question, have they been briefed? Mr. Cameron, we got, I don't know, anywhere between 3 to 4 to 5 minutes left. And I do want to do one last plug-in, of course, of your website. Again, www.presidentialufo.com. presidentialufo.com, and of course he'll be speaking at Zero International this weekend, Saturday, September 20th, at the Culver City Memorial Veterans Memorial, and it is here in Los Angeles, in Southern California. And next week, this is a global station. We have hosts in the UK, in Australia, and other countries. You will also be speaking at the Leeds conference, right? Why don't you give people a minute of what you're going to be doing next, and then from now until the music comes on, I want to give you a chance to give everyone your final thoughts.
Okay, I'm doing the contactee thing this weekend. Next weekend, I'll do some of the contactee things, but I will probably be doing the consciousness thing. I've been very impressed and done a lot of research in the last year on inspiration and downloads. That a lot of what we have in the world, we've gotten from somewhere else. We're getting help by aliens. We're getting help by spirits. We're getting help by all sorts of different people who are downloading material. And I've just finished a manuscript, and it hasn't been edited or anything, but I've got a manuscript that goes through all the different downloads and inspirations, Nobel Prizes, famous songs like Yesterday by the Beatles, which came in a dream. I go through all this kind of stuff and show this thing that this is connected, that all of, when you get to consciousness and UFOs and all this kind of stuff, it's all connected. So that's a lot of what I'll be doing in Leeds, England. And my book that's out is the book from my old days. I will not change a single word in it. It is absolutely right. I do a book on UFOs, Area 51. George Knapp bought a bunch of copies for all the people that had worked with him on it. He said it is the closest version of truth to what happened at Area 51. So that book is out there. I'll have it in California. And it goes through the cover-up. It shows you clearly that the government is disclosing. And now I've moved past the government disclosure, and I'm showing how the aliens are disclosing, and there's nothing the government can do to stop it. The aliens are in control of the situation, and they are leaking the story bit by bit, and they are going to the people on the ground who can't be stopped by the government. And they're also one of the big downloads that occurred in the last 50 years, the download of the computer. That came through inspirational downloads, the whole idea for the computer and the internet, the podcast. This is what we can do. We can do the podcast. We can do that. We don't have to worry for the major media. It is the media on the internet that will break this thing wide open, not the New York Post or the Washington Times. It is up to us. We have something to do, and we should do what we can with the information we have.
And this is exactly why we've had you, Mr. Grant Cameron. This is why he won the Researcher of the Year award. This is a true researcher. He actually follows up with things. And again, it was truly an honor. Everyone, again, join us next week for more Research on a Mission Radio, and I will see you next time.